after completing drills, according to the Interfax news agency. Have you seen these reports, and what does that suggest to you about a possible invasion being turned away?
I haven't seen the reports that you're referring to, Tom. Certainly our latest intelligence suggests that an invasion is imminent, that it's highly likely, and that we've seen 100,000 troops stationed around the border. Separately, the Russians have claimed that they have no plans for an invasion, but we will need to see a full-scale removal of troops to show that is true.
But if this is true from the Interfax news, if this is true, that is a good sign, isn't it, if troops are leaving there?
Well, I would need to see more details, Tom, to understand if that has any major implications.
OK, we'll wait and see. Clearly, one of the diplomatic off-ramps for this is just to not allow Ukraine to join NATO. Do you think that's going to be acceptable to Ukraine?
Well, I think it would be a disaster to do that, because this situation has entirely come about through Russian aggression, by Russia stationing 100,000 troops on its border and also carrying out cyber attacks on Ukraine, trying to install a puppet government in Kiev and trying to undermine Ukrainian legitimacy and democracy. And if Russia was rewarded by achieving their long-standing goal of stopping Ukraine joining NATO, that would simply encourage more aggression in the future. And I think the lesson we need to learn from what has happened over the past 15 years is that every time Russia are allowed to get away with it, they simply expand their ambitions. And this is the time when the West has to stand up, to be very clear there will be tough sanctions, to be very clear that we will help Ukraine, and we've been helping Ukraine with defensive weapons, and that we will not stand for further Russian bullying of Ukraine.
So what is then the way forward that Sergei Lavrov referred to yesterday? What do you think, what is that way forward, if not about Ukraine not being in NATO?
Well, we cannot give Russia concessions for their aggression. What we can do, and this is what NATO is offered, is to have talks with Russia, for the US to have talks with Russia about areas like transparency. There was already agreements that we would discuss these issues more frequently, that we would agree, for example, why Russia have stationed 100,000 troops close to Ukraine's border. So there is space for more discussion about protecting Europe's security architecture. What there isn't space for is Russia essentially having a veto over another sovereign nation's membership of NATO. That's completely off the table.
Do you think then, in what it is you are discussing with the Russians, you met Sergei Lavrov, you didn't get on particularly well, I think it's fair to say, but do you think that both he and Putin, on whatever is hopefully agreed to avert this war, do you think they are reliable partners?
Well, what we are hearing from them in terms of the rhetoric is very different from what they are actually doing. So stationing 100,000 troops on the Ukrainian border is undoubtedly threatening, and yet they claim that they are under a security threat. That simply isn't credible. And that is the point I made to Sergei Lavrov.
So they are fundamentally unreliable.
I do not trust what they have said, and there have been numerous occasions where we've seen, as I've said, false flag incidents set up by the Russians. We very much fear a false flag in the next few days where the Russians pretend that there has been provocation by Ukraine in order to justify an invasion. We've seen attempts to install a puppet government. And there is not a free media in Russia. So much of the material that comes out from Russia simply isn't true.
Can I ask you about the build-up of troops that we're seeing, what any potential invasion might look like, and particularly the concern there is about the number of tanks that Russia has built up? The possibility exists of tanks rolling into Ukraine, doesn't it?
This certainly does, and we have seen the build-up of all military forces from Russia and surrounding Ukraine, so we are very fearful of an attack on Kiev in particular. So there are Russian troops stationed and ready to go in a posture that indicates that they are shortly about to invade Ukraine.
Now,
I think it's important to note, Tom.
Can I just put this to you very quickly? This was the Prime Minister talking about this issue of tanks on the European borders. This is what he said in the Liaison Committee on the 17th of November last year. Take a listen.
I think what I'm trying to make clear is I think that it's now or never for the UK armed forces. We have to recognise that the old concepts of of fighting big tank battles on the European landmass, which I think is what you're driving at, are over.
That unfortunately is wrong, isn't it?
Well, what we have been doing is we've been supplying anti-tank weaponry into Ukraine. So we have been supplying defensive weaponry. We haven't been supplying offensive weaponry because we want to help protect Ukraine, but we don't want to cause any kind of provocation.
The Prime Minister's assessment that tanks are not going to roll into Europe because those days are gone, that's proven to be wrong given the build-up of tanks that there is on the Russia-Ukrainian border.
We are very worried about a tank offensive into Ukraine, but it's not the only possibility, Tom.
No, sure.
There are all kinds of ways in which the attack could take place, and what we have seen is the huge amassing of troops.
But that assessment is wrong based on the intelligence that you've got currently about what the Russians are capable of doing.
They certainly are capable of staging a tank invasion.
Let me ask you then about some of the sanctions. We've heard a lot about what could be possible. Is it a case that the UK would seek to remove Russia from SWIFT, the international banking system, and therefore stop, as the Prime Minister said, the ATMs flowing with cash in Moscow?
I'm not going to go into the details of what sanctions we have ready to go in the event of an incursion, but what I can say is last week we laid legislation which enables us to target anything of interest to the Russian government or the Russian economy. So that covers banks, that covers oligarchs, it covers energy companies, it covers defence companies. And what's important is that we're working with our allies, the United States, the EU, so we have a coordinated package. So the Russian economy would be hit really hard. But I'm not going to speculate. All I will say, Tom, is nothing is off the table in terms of those sanctions.
Can you give us a suggestion about how long those sanctions might last for? Your colleague James Heappey, the Armed Forces Minister, said yesterday it would last years.
Well, it would last as long as Russia is in Ukraine.
Okay, so the sanctions would come off when Russia withdrew forces.
The whole purpose is stopping Russia invade Ukraine. But certainly they would go on as long as that remained a problem.
Can I ask you about a domestic financial issue? Are you happy as someone who once talked about the Uber riding freedom lovers that there are in a deregulated economy? Are you happy with tax rises on national insurance coming in April?
I don't think anybody is happy with the idea of taxation in the Conservative Party. We're a low tax party, but we have spent a lot of money during the COVID crisis, and we have to make sure that we are able to keep our finances in good shape. And obviously the Chancellor is responsible for making sure that we have the right fiscal policy to address that.
You're on the record for a long time about your Thatcherite credentials when it comes to taxation. You can't have supported a tax rise, even in principle, but certainly one that is coming in April when the cost of living crisis is so huge. Could there be no room at all to move it back?
As I've said, we spent $400 billion providing support during COVID, and the reality is that does need to be paid for.
But in April, specifically, it has to come in April. Surely you've made representations. I'm sure you've made representations to the Chancellor and Prime Minister on this.
As I've said, the Chancellor has to look at the whole picture. He has to make sure we're able to balance the books and retain our hard-won financial credibility.
That's a very diplomatic answer. Let me ask you finally about the organisation NAWZAD. I believe I'm right, tell me if I'm wrong, that the Foreign Office is looking into who it was that ultimately signed off on that plane being allowed to go into Kabul airport. What have you found thus far about who it was that ultimately gave that decision?
What we are looking into is how was a confidential email leaked, and that investigation is taking place under the leadership of our Permanent Secretary. We're very clear, and the Defence Secretary is being clear, is he is the one that gave the authorisation for that to take place.
He is the email that suggested that the Prime Minister cleared it is wrong.
As I've said, the Defence Secretary is very clear that he is the one that authorised it.
So it is wrong.
I'm not going to comment on leaked emails. I just want to say the Defence Secretary is clear that he is the one who signed it off.
Very, very odd then that the suggestion would be in a number of different emails that the Prime Minister signed it off. How do you think that happened?
Well, what we're investigating at the Foreign Office is how confidential emails entered the public domain, and I'm not going to comment on leaks. What I will say is the Defence Secretary signed it off. He's been very clear about that, and of course I was not Foreign Secretary at the time,
No.
so I'm relying on what people who were involved at the time have told me.
But you're satisfied that it was a call made by Ben Wallace?
Absolutely, he's been very clear about that.
Can I finish with what is being described as a joke? And given the situation, the danger of the situation in Ukraine and Russia, a joke that is causing some controversy over at the BBC. I wonder if you take a listen to Graham Norton.
Boris still hanging on in there. And this week, he flew off to Ukraine. Or if you're watching on Catch-Up TV, he flew off to southwest Russia.
Do you think the BBC should apologise for that?
Well, I'm a believer in free speech. I don't necessarily believe that every joke on the BBC is in good taste, but I certainly don't support a censorship state that stops comedians making jokes.
So you don't particularly find it funny, but you think the BBC are right not to apologise on free speech grounds?
Yes.
Very good to have you on. Thank you for your time. Foreign Secretary Liz Truss, Minister for Women and Equalities, Conservative MP for South West Norfolk. Come to your calls in a few moments. The news at 9 is next.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 9 o'clock, the Foreign Secretary Liz Truss has told